Welcome to Specially Designed Instruction. My name is Ann Beninghof, and I'll be your facilitator today as we learn about this very important topic. Just a little quick background on me. I have been in special education for 43 years and have worked from age 3 through 21, plus college. I've done a lot of different things. I like variety. So I'll be sharing ideas that apply to all those grade levels and all different content areas. Let's start off with a game to get some prior knowledge activation going. On your screen, you can see a variety of letters. Not all the letters of the alphabet are there. Your job is to look at these and create words using just these letters that are related to the topic of specially designed instruction. So look them over, find some words that you can spell using just these letters. Now you'll notice that there are 2 E's. So if you need a word with 2 E's, you can do that, but there's only 1 A. So if you needed a word that needed 2 A's, you'd have to skip on that one. Go ahead and jot them down on a piece of paper. You can pause the video at this point, take yourself 30, 45 seconds, and then come on back with me. I'm guessing that some of you might have seen IEP as an option. That is definitely related to this topic. Maybe some of you found the word goal or goals very important for our topic of specially designed instruction. You might have also seen plan. That term design means that things are planned, very intentional. And maybe some of you saw words like ACE or tone or grade or even grace. All of these words can activate some of your prior knowledge about this topic. Today's session is going to focus on 2 learning targets. By the end of this session, I'd like you to feel like you can say, I can identify critical components of effective SDI. And secondly, I can evaluate various tools and methods for strengthening SDI practices. So I'm going to share as many of those practical tools and methods as possible from my own experience as an educator. If you're watching by yourself, then please feel free to pause the video and reflect at certain points. And then if you're watching with others, then feel free to pause the video and discuss with other people your ahas or your ideas or reactions to the various tools and methods we talk about. Let's jump in with the phrase specially designed instruction and kind of analyze the definition a little bit. This is a term that is from our federal law, and it's been in the federal law since the early 1970s, so it's nothing new. But these 3 words give us a lot of information. First, the law assumes that what we're doing as special educators is something different, something special. And so we want to be asking ourselves on a daily basis, did I do something special when I was working with students with IEPs? Second word, designed, means that it's very intentional and planned for. And then our third word, instruction, is critical because this is what differentiates it from accommodations. And we'll look some more at that in a moment. So with these 3 words, the legal definition in the federal law has 2 components. And I like to break it down into the 3 whats and then the 3 whys. So these are the 3 whats from the law. Specially designed instruction means adapting content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. Adapting content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. In essence, this is the definition of special education, and it is also the job description of every special educator. This is what we are meant to be doing on a daily basis. And that word adapting links back to the word special. We're supposed to be changing up, adapting the general ed process and doing something special. Then the 3 whys, number 1, to address the unique needs of a child with a disability. Now, I always encourage people to add a little asterisk or a caret here and add in the phrase IEP goal-based. Because if you think about it, when we write IEP goals for students, we do so to address their unique needs. Therefore, most experts in this field, especially design instruction, We all agree that for something to be SDI, it should be linked to an IEP goal. Now, it might be very clearly and directly linked, or it might be slightly more indirectly linked. So as an example, let's say we have a student who has a reading comprehension goal, and you are teaching an adapted reading comprehension strategy that is clearly linked to the IEP goal. But perhaps that same student has a very difficult time focusing attention on printed material. So you decide to teach a strategy for focusing attention because you know the student needs that in order to accomplish their goal. Then that would be indirectly linked, and that might very well still be considered specially designed instruction. The second why, according to the law, or the second purpose, is to provide access to the general ed curriculum. This is why inclusive practices make so much more sense for most students, because it's easy to provide equitable access if the student is in the general ed setting. And then third, in order to meet the standards, and that term meet is very important. It doesn't say access the standards, it says meet the standards. The vast majority of our students with disabilities should be able to meet the standards, or for a few that are on alternate standards, they should be meeting those alternate standards. This means that we need to have very high expectations for our students with IEPs. And it also means that as a special educator, if the students are not meeting their standards, then I need to make sure I can feel confident saying that I have provided specially designed instruction and not just accommodations or good general ed teaching practices. Here's a quote I love from a teacher named Johnny Catafo. He once said, "You can't teach a child to swim by taking them out of the pool." And I love this quote, but I think I would add to it, nor by just throwing them in. So placement in inclusive practices is wonderful, but we need to make sure we're providing the specially designed instruction so that our students with IEPs do not drown in those environments. Now, there's two more terms that are really relevant to this topic, and they are the terms accommodation and modification. Take a moment and read through these definitions. Pause the video if you need to for some time to do so. Now, everyone has heard these terms, and I'm betting that in addition to hearing these terms, you may have heard them used interchangeably, synonymously. Unfortunately, they are not synonymous in education circles. They are in the greater world, but they are not. They have very specific meanings in education. Modifications mean a lowering of the standards. So we very rarely make modifications in special education. We make modifications for students who are on alternate standards or for whom the IEP team has decided to lower the expectations. The vast majority of what special educators do is make adaptations. Remember, we're adapting content, methodology, or delivery. So we make adaptations or accommodations. So these are the two words that we should be using most often, very rarely using the term modification, because we don't want to confuse things. Now, you know a lot about accommodations. And so let's just talk for a moment about where the accommodations fall legally. My colleague Sonia Kunkel came up with this great visual for looking at how it all kind of fits together. So in the center bullseye is IDEA, our large federal special education law. And the name of this has changed slightly over the years, but we kind of all think of it as IDEA. And under IDEA, students with disabilities that need special education are given the right to modifications, if necessary, and specially designed instruction. This law fits under 504, which is where students with disabilities are given the right to accommodations. So accommodations actually fall into a different category of legal protection. Now, if a student only needs accommodations, In the classroom, perhaps, maybe they need accommodations in high stakes testing, maybe they need accommodations in grading. If that's all they need, they don't receive special education. And that right there shows us that the primary responsibility for accommodations rests with general educators. The primary responsibility of special educators is providing SDI. This fits under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provides accommodations and protections in all walks of life. And then all of this, excuse me, fits under the Office of Civil Rights. And I like to be reminded that SDI is a civil right for students with disabilities that have IEPs. It's a civil right, which gives it a lot of power. Now, in addition, I'd like to share with you a different bullseye, one that I created because I got a lot of questions from people about, well, how is SDI different from differentiated instruction or different from universal design for learning? So here's my thought on it. Universal design for learning, UDL, is this big, beautiful vision of how we could set up classrooms and schools in such a way that it is accessible to all students, that all students will be successful. UDL is a general education initiative or a general education practice. So you can have a UDL classroom in your school, and then in that classroom, differentiated instruction is going to be taking place. And we might be differentiating based on student interests, student readiness level, student profiles, physical needs, environmental needs, all of those kinds of things. Differentiated instruction is a general education practice. And then in classrooms across the country, we have MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or in your state, you might call it RTI, response to intervention. Both of those systems have usually 3 tiers. Tier 1 is good quality general education classroom practices, and all students are eligible for that. And then we have tier 2 and 3 for kids who need a little more intervention, and that still is a general education practice. Then finally, in this classroom, we might have a student with an IEP, and that student is eligible for UDL, DI, MTSS, and specially designed instruction. Excuse me. Specially designed instruction is linked to the student's IEP goals. And that's what makes it different from everything else here that you see on the screen. It is linked directly to the student's IEP goals. This would be a great time to take a pause and chat with people that might be with you or reflect on your understanding of that. Does that sound similar to what your interpretation might be? Now let's look at one more term, and that term is something that we call incidental benefit. And this is a term that comes in the law. And the reason I like to talk about this is that as I've traveled around the country as a consultant, I have often had people say to me, well, Anne, it can only be SDI if you're only working with students with IEPs, and then the rest of the kids can't be in that group. And that's a bit of a misconception. So let's look at this term, incidental benefit, and a couple of illustrations of how it might play out in the classroom. Start at the top with me, please, and just read through that first paragraph and look at the legend. Because specially designed instruction is a legal term, it only can apply to students with IEPs, but that doesn't mean that other students can't be in the group receiving incidental benefit. So let's look at a couple of classroom examples. Let's look at this first example and say that I'm co-teaching in an 8th grade class, and there are some students in the class that have an IEP goal around reading comprehension. And I've thought of a strategy that I think is going to really help them with identifying supporting details and evidence. And I go to my colleague, my co-teacher, and I say, hey, I have a really great idea for how to teach this that I think will really help our students with IEPs, but maybe some other kids in the class. What do you think? And he or she listens to me and they say, I like that strategy for our students with IEPs, but I don't think anybody else will benefit from it. So why don't you pull those kids off to the side and work with just them, and I'll work with the rest of the class in my traditional method. And I might say, okay, and I'll do this occasionally, but I don't want to do it very often for two reasons. First, it stigmatizes those students that get pulled to the side. And especially as you move up through the grades, that's going to be more and more of a problem. But secondly, I'm hesitant to do that because typically there are a few other kids in the class that could benefit from the expertise that I bring to the classroom. And so when we work in different ways other than this, then the general ed teacher is learning some strategies from me, and the other kids are benefiting from that second person's expertise in the classroom. So let's look at this next example. Let's say I talk to my co-teacher and she says, hey, I think that's a great idea, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable teaching it. You seem so much more comfortable with that strategy. Would you mind leading the lesson and I'll support you? I say, great. So now we teach it as a whole class lesson, and our students with IEPs are included, sprinkled throughout the room. They are now receiving specially designed instruction because I designed it based on their needs and their IEP goals. Now I'm instructing it, but other students receive incidental benefit. That's a win for everyone. Or another option is that maybe my general ed co-teacher, after I explain the strategy, says, hey, I think that's an easy strategy to teach. Why don't we break into two groups and I can teach half the class and you can teach half the class? And now we can break the students with IEPs into two groups so that they're not all clustered together. Small group instruction is almost always more effective. And so now we've got small group instruction and we're both providing the SDI. Most states, the law allows for general ed teachers to provide SDI if it's been designed with the special educator. The federal law has no prohibitions against this, and it makes so much more sense to work in small group instruction when we can. So incidental benefit is a huge plus from inclusive practice. Now, we're going to analyze some examples from classrooms. And I want to say first that specially designed instruction takes place wherever students are. So if you're not doing co-teaching or inclusive practice, that's fine. Wherever those students are that have IEPs, you are still meant to be providing specially designed instruction. My teaching experience over the last 20 years or so has all been inclusive practice. And so the examples I'll be sharing today come from my co-teaching experience, simply because I want to be authentic with you about real examples that I have participated in. But keep in mind that there can be examples of SDI in resource room and specially designed classrooms, separate day classrooms, all of that kind of thing. If you want more examples, you'll find a wide range of examples from all different settings and grade levels in my book, Specially Designed Instruction, Increasing Success for Students with Disabilities. And then if you want more information on co-teaching, you can find lots more on the co-teaching aspect in my book, Co-Teaching That Works, Structures and Strategies for Maximizing Student Learning. But for now, we're going to jump ahead and I'm going to provide you some guiding questions so that you can make some determinations about these examples I give you. Are they SDI? Yes, no, or maybe it depends. You're not quite sure. The law, unfortunately, does not give us any guiding questions, but in my conversation with other experts all around the country and by exploring the limited information that the law does give us, I feel pretty confident that these guiding questions will get you to a solid answer about whether something is specially designed instruction or not. You may choose to take a screenshot of this, but I'm also going to give it to you in an abbreviated format after we go through this lengthier list of questions. So question number one, Is it special? Remember that word adapting content methodology or delivery. So SDI is something that's special. It's something different from the typical general ed practice. If the general education practices were working for students with disabilities, they wouldn't have IEP goals. Doesn't mean that general ed practices aren't fantastic. If you think about it, they work for 85 to 90% of the population, which is pretty darn amazing. But for some students with IEPs, because of their disabilities, those practices aren't working effectively enough. And so the special educator is supposed to be doing something special, something adapted. Second and third go together. Does it address the unique needs as related to an IEP goal? And of course, if there's an IEP goal, then we're always collecting progress monitoring data. Or I shouldn't maybe say always, but ongoing. It's an ongoing process that we're collecting data to show whether we're making that progress. Number 4, this is critical because this is what differentiates something from an accommodation. So we talked earlier a little bit, you read through some definitions of accommodations. Accommodations are things like graphic organizers, word banks, preferential seating, partially completed notes, study guides, extended time, color coding. All of those things are wonderful accommodations, but they are not specially designed instruction. They are something different, legally something different, in practice something different. They are not instruction. And unfortunately, sometimes special educators end up kind of in the practice of just providing accommodations, particularly in general ed co-taught classrooms, where they are really supposed to, by law, be providing instruction as well. Number 5, is it intentional, designed to bring about progress? Remember that middle word, designed, especially designed instruction. This means that we're looking at our data, we're looking at what we know about students' present levels of performances and their strengths and needs, and really being intentional about our lesson planning. And then I think 6 and 7 go together. We're trying to build independence in students, of course, and so we want those skills to be transferable or generalizable. Now I'm going to boil this all down into just 5 key phrases for you to think about as you look at these examples, and this will be a little bit easier to retain or to jot in your notes if you would like. And all of this is explained in more detail in the book. So if you have a copy of the book and are doing a book study, you can look at that. And if you don't have a copy of it yet, here are 5 key phrases: special, instruction, IEP goal, data collection, and generalizable. So with these in mind, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and your job is to decide, yes, that's an example of SDI. No, it's not an example of SDI, or it depends. You're not quite sure. Maybe there's some information that you feel is missing. If you are with someone else, after we look at the example, you're very welcome to pause the video and turn and discuss it. So here comes the first one. I was co-teaching in a middle school science classroom, and my co-teacher said, okay, Anne, next week on Monday, we're going to start looking at the different events and history led to the development of the microscope, and we're going to introduce students to the microscope. Now, we didn't have enough microscopes in this class for all the kids to have their own microscope. And so we talked about it and we decided it might be best if we did 2 groups. One group would work with a microscope, and the other group, she wanted to read the text that went along and answer some questions. Great. Now, after we've got our learning target, we want to go and look at the IEP goals that I can address in the classroom, because that's my job for being in there, is to address IEP goals. So there were 2 goals that we felt like could easily be woven into this lesson. A couple of our students had goals around identifying the main idea or central idea of a text, and then how it's conveyed through details. And you may have students that you know of that have that kind of goal too. And then we had one student who had a goal around improving his visual attention to texts that he wasn't interested in. So with these two goals in mind, I'm going to show you a video clip, and you can be thinking about, is what I'm doing with my group an example of SDI based on these IEP goals? This particular video comes from a video on co-teaching that the Bureau of Education and Research put together, and I had the wonderful opportunity to be involved in the making of this. So you're going to see me in my younger days. This particular clip is just about 2 minutes in length, and I have their permission to show it to you, as well as I have several of these short clips with their permission on my YouTube channel. So if you're looking for co-teaching video clips, just go to YouTube, search Ann Beninghof, and you'll find a variety of them there. All right, here we go. This video will last about 2 minutes in length.
Slide.
At the bottom of page
sliding
45.
back and forth.
Read that.
The last thing
on
we
your
talked
own,
about was the
and
diaphragm.
then write
that dial
a
that turned
word,
the
1,
light
2, or 3,
so that it was more intense.
often-
The parallel structure helps co-teachers make the best use of classroom resources.
So these are called objectives. Turn it to the low power objective, turn it to the medium power objective, and then to the high power objective.
By dividing the class in half, the classroom teacher is able to give each student a microscope and intensify the value and immediacy of her instruction.
What's it doing to your stage?
In this smaller group, the teacher is more easily able to check for understanding and provide individual help.
In science, we often don't have enough equipment for 30 to 32 kids to have, let's say, a microscope. And so by having 2 groups, we can divide and have more people have their own microscope to work with. And another group can be learning about the things that go along with that particular topic.
We're going to take this and we're going to open it over the page, and we're going to slide it in like that. And by putting it in this way, it's going to stay in place really well.
Students working with the specialist will read about the development of cell theory and take notes on report covers.
And I can write on my textbook without really writing on the textbook. After reading each paragraph, your task is to write a word or 2 or 3. No more than 3 words. So how many words can you write at the most? 3. You can do 1, 2, or 3. You're going to write a word in the margin of your textbook that summarizes what that paragraph was mostly about. So for me,
The parallel structure makes this hands-on type of note-taking manageable and productive.
who has one that they want to share that they came up with? Go ahead.
Animalcules equals bacteria.
Student accountability and involvement increase.
Bacteria. Did anybody have something about either bacteria or animalcules? Okay. Anybody have something really different? Really different.
Observing living cells.
Okay. It was about him observing living cells. Okay. You had that too? Okay. Go ahead and read the next paragraph.
Textbook work is so visual and auditory, and so many of our struggling students are tactile and kinesthetic learners. By putting the page covers over the pages, they now have the opportunity to write on them, which makes more tactile interaction with the text.
Turn the eyepiece and it will remove the pointer.
Let's make sure you're reading.
The smaller group sizes generated by the parallel structure help boost both the effectiveness and the practicality of using hands-on resources in classroom lessons.
A 4.
All right, what do you think? Was that an example of SDI? Unfortunately, the law does not give us a list of examples at all. So we really have to be able to think and discuss and justify our practices or explain why we think it is SDI or not. So I'm going to break it down for you a little bit from my perspective, my opinion, but remember, there's nothing in the law that says that I'm necessarily right. It's just my own way of thinking about it after studying this topic quite a lot. So first of all, this tool, which I love and have used at every grade level for kids, can be very effective for any materials that they cannot annotate. This is not SDI. This is an accommodation. It's a wonderful tool or an accommodation. So if you're thinking about this part and you said accommodation or no, it's not SDI, I would agree with you. However, what I was doing in teaching the students to stop at the end of each paragraph and summarize in 1 to 3 words, that was addressing their need to find main idea and supporting details. The science teacher would not have taught it that way. She would have just had them read through the text and after reading, answer the questions. So I'm adapting instruction based on their IEP goals, giving them something tactile and visual because I knew that some of our students would do well with a multi-sensory approach, and chunking it in little bits, teaching them what they could do. And then that's very generalizable that they could take that elsewhere. So I believe that I provided SDI for the comprehension goal. The visual perseverance goal, this is a tool that I gave them. It's an accommodation, but it wasn't instruction on how to visually persevere. And so in that case, I think I was accommodating for their needs, but not necessarily providing SDI on that goal. So that's our first example. Now let's go ahead and we're going to look at another example. And this one, first, I want to just show you a template of this. So this is something I call a focus tool. And I've used this at all grade levels. We usually take a square, although I'll show you some variations in a moment, a square of cardstock, and we laminate it. So we can write on it with dry erase or water-based markers. Around the edges, we put little bits of colored acetate. And then we decide what we want students focusing in on in their work. So let's look at a couple of examples. The very first one I ever did is up here in the top left, a writing tool for revising and editing work. So you can see under the red bit of acetate, we've written in the word spelling, and then under yellow, punctuation, for blue, word choice, for green, sentence length. These were 4 criteria that the classroom teacher wanted students checking for as they were revising or looking at over their work. But you could choose any 4 criteria. Maybe you want kids looking for use of alliteration or metaphor or adverbs, first name on their paper, commas, ending punctuation, whatever it might be. Now down below that, you can see one that an algebra teacher created with me. He had a 5-step algorithm process he wanted kids to follow. And so they all created pentagon shapes and wrote that out. And then off to the right, you can see something that a high school science teacher created with students because he wanted their lab reports to have certain components and he wanted them to start to realize what those components needed to be without having necessarily headings on some kind of pre-printed thing. And so that's how he did it. There's all kinds of things that you could use this for. I had a 2nd grade teacher just take an index card and on each end she wrote ING, ED, and had 2 different colors, and she had kids searching through books for ING endings or ED endings. Now, I love this tool, but to me, this is not SDI. It's a tool. Plus, I kind of did a little trick here in that I didn't even give you an IEP goal. If there's no IEP goal, then it's probably not SDI. If there's no instruction, it is definitely not specially designed instruction. This is a great tool or accommodations, but would not fall into the category of specially designed instruction. Now let's look at one more. And this time I will give you an IEP goal, but just because I'm giving you that doesn't necessarily mean that this is an example of SDI. So you think it through with those 5 clue phrases I've given you. My 1st grade co-teaching partner said, okay, Anne, next week the students are starting on narratives and they need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end to their narrative. Great. So there was a student in our class that had an IEP goal about printing her name, upper and lowercase letters. We were in 1st grade. She was really still struggling with just even making the capital A, which is the first letter of her name. And we had consulted with occupational therapy, and it didn't seem to be a fine motor issue. It seemed to be more of a memory issue. And we tried a variety of things. So I said, okay, well, this is what I'm going to try to work with her on in the middle of this writing lesson, right? So, and when we're working in small groups, we're going to do this. So I decided to try something called backwards chaining. Now, you may be very familiar with these terms. If not, forwards chaining is something that's done in schools all the time. You may just not call it that. So if we're teaching a letter formation, forwards chaining would be you start with the first step, which is drawing that first leg of the A, and then the second step, and then the third step. And that's how you teach kids to make an A. Backwards chaining means that you start with all but the last step. And in this case, that would be adding the crossbar, and you have students just add the last step until they get that, and they're so successful with it and really almost always getting it correct. And then you would remove the second to the last step. And then you'd go back and remove the third to the last step. So you're moving backwards chaining once they have success. So it means that they have success with a completed task, and then you're moving backwards. Some of our students that are just doing forwards chaining, they may never get to that completed end result. And so it's frustrating and they can give up, whereas this takes them backwards. This can be applied in any content, any grade level that has a process associated with it with various steps. This is especially helpful like in job training and community-based instruction and things like that as well. So that is forwards and backwards chaining. Your job now is to think, do you think this is specially designed instruction? Yes, no, or you're not sure. To me, this is a solid yes. Backwards chaining is not something that's done very often in general education at all. So there's a good chance that I would have adapted the instruction, in this case, yes, to teach it differently. It was based on the student's IEP goal and what we knew about the student and what hadn't worked with the student. We were trying something new. It is also a research-based strategy, which is important because special educators are required by law to use research-based strategies whenever possible. Can it lead to generalizability? Absolutely, because we can teach just about everything with backwards chaining, but once she's learned how to make this letter, then she's going to be able to generalize that to other situations. And it was clearly instruction, not just an accommodation. So I say that's a big yes. Now, I want you to have access to a variety of different examples. And so I have provided for you a variety of case studies. There's about 8 or 10, I think, that you can access by scanning this QR code. You can choose different grade level ones that you want to read or different topical ones that you'd like to read. And you can reflect on those and discuss with a partner if you have one. Additional case studies can be found on my website, www.speciallydesignedinstruction.org. So check those out if you're looking for more examples to help you understand exactly what SDI is. Take a moment now and just write yourself a sentence or two, kind of capture your new learning or maybe a confirmation of what you know about SDI before we continue on. So the second part of this time together, I want to share with you the planning steps and tools that we have found to be particularly helpful for being both efficient and effective. And you can find this graphic on my website, speciallydesignedinstruction.org, as well as in the book. And we're going to go through these planning steps that I put together. They were working for me, and so I want to share them with others. The first 3 steps you can kind of bracket, if you will, and think of these as the information gathering steps. First, if I'm working with someone else or I'm just working with my teacher manual, I need to clarify what is the learning target for that particular lesson so that we can be very specific about what we're trying to accomplish. And then we have a quick conversation about what's hard about that so that we can proactively prevent some difficulties. And then really important step 3, we're going to choose those IEP goals to address during the lesson. Now, you may want to screenshot this if you don't have a copy of the book. We're going to come back to these 7 steps in a few moments. But what we're going to do is look at some video of a planning session that I had with Jeff, who I was co-teaching with. And Jeff, at the time, was an 8th grade social studies teacher. But these steps, they apply at whatever grade level you're teaching. When we co-plan our lessons together, it usually takes about 10 or so minutes to get through 1 or 2 lessons and kind of outline what we're going to do. And I've broken this video down into chunks so that you can see it based on the steps. So you're going to see about 2 minutes of Jeff and I going through these first 3 steps. And as you watch this, just take some notes about what stands out for you. And then after the video is complete, feel free to pause and chat about it if you have others with you. Here we go.
All right, so Jeff, I know that this is the lesson that you're feeling like didn't work so well last year.
Yeah.
And so we're gonna try and figure out how to transform it a little bit.
Sure.
Your learning target is pretty straightforward, really clear. I love that. I can list, define, and provide examples of each of the 7 roles of the President of the United States. Is that changing? Do you feel like that still
Yeah.
is what you want them to do?
I'm not convinced that it's important that they can list the roles of the president. I think if they can identify the roles, they can be familiar with them, but I don't know if that list term is really needed for us.
Well, true, because we're not teaching them how to make a list.
No,
Right? And
right.
that probably makes it more accessible for some of the kids.
Right.
So define and provide examples. Isn't that in essence describing?
Sure.
So could we just say, would it be right to say, I can describe each of the 7 roles of the president?
Yeah, I think that would really clarify that.
Okay.
I think it would clarify that.
Good. All right, great. So I can describe. So by the end of a lesson or the end of, is this 2 or 3 days of material or what?
Yeah,
Are you
I
thinking?
think in the past it's taken about 2.5 days to do. And so,
Okay.
yeah, 2 or 3 day allotment of time for this, I think would be sufficient.
Great, because it did sound like a lot
Yeah,
for some of our students.
Right.
Especially some of our students with IEPs. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is a lot in one lesson.
yeah,
Okay.
seven roles of the president is a challenge for some
Yeah,
kids.
okay. So what was difficult about it when you've taught it before?
A couple things that I think we've struggled with. Number one, just the amount, like 7 roles of the
Mhm,
president.
mhm.
And that's a lot for students, for all students really to remember, and not only remember, but give some examples of it. So that's the first thing I think they really struggled with. The second thing is some of the terminology that we use for the roles of the president are foreign to the students. For example, there's one of the roles that we call chief of state, which is the ceremonial function for the president. And that word state kind of trips students up because when they hear the word state, they think Wisconsin, they think Minnesota.
Sure.
They don't think President Trump laying a wreath at Arlington National Cemetery as that role.
Right. So I hear you say 2 kind of primary things. One is memory
Mhm.
issues, like remembering, they have to remember all 7.
Yeah,
And what those mean. And then the other is the term, some of the vocabulary that's within it.
right.
And that actually works in really well with the IEP goals for the students in our class that
Mhm.
have IEP goals, because we have several that have memory goals.
Yeah.
And then the vocabulary is all about comprehension, and there's a lot of goals.
Right. I
related
think
to
almost all of our students have some sort of goal related to that
that.
vocabulary.
Okay, good. So I think we've got IEP goals in there. So, I was thinking about,
So what always strikes me or stands out to me when I watch this video is that Jeff says right there at the end, yeah, almost all of our kids have vocabulary goals. He knows the IEP goals. So I'm going to share with you 2 really valuable approaches that help us with that. The first is that we always have something in our lesson planning documents that focuses us in on specially designed instruction. So this is my favorite lesson planning form. Everybody likes to plan lessons in different ways. The most important parts here is that we have a heading that says, how will we support with accommodations? And another heading that says, how will we support specially designed instruction? So this brings us back to always making sure we're weaving that into the lesson. That's something that I should be doing in most cases on a daily basis. If you plan with a weekly lesson planning form, you can do the same thing. Here again is an example, and I've got specially designed instruction and accommodations listed there. And so we're always making sure we're providing those. But the other thing that's extremely helpful is something that we call an IEP goals at a glance page. Now, this is different than what you might automatically think of as a student's IEP at a glance. And those are super effective. But if we have 6 or 7 or 5 kids or however many, 10 kids with IEPs in a classroom, it's not very user-friendly to have all of those IEPs at a glance all out in front of you at once. It just doesn't really work for planning purposes. So what we create is something called an IEP goals at a glance by period or by classroom. I'll show you the elementary version in a second, but here's a secondary example. Down the left-hand column, we have the first names of the students that would be in that co-taught math class. And then here in the middle, we have their IEP goals that are relevant to that class, and we list them in brief, just to capture the essence of them. We don't need to have all the language in front of us. As a matter of fact, it gets in the way if we do. So just in brief, we've just captured that, and we get it all on one page. So even if we have to use very small font, we want to make sure it's all on one page. That means all we have to do when we're planning is open this up on our computer or have a paper copy of it. Frankly, I love to have a paper copy of it on my clipboard that I'm using as I'm walking around the classroom. And I also love for our paraeducators to have a copy of this that they can use in the classroom so that we're all hyper focused on what are the IEP goals that we're working on. Here's an example of how you might set it up if you're at the elementary level. And we just like to break it down by content area. So you can see on the left there, we have language arts, math goals, social, emotional, or other. And then during that block of time, we can look to see what are the goals that we need to be working on. Some of my colleagues have been really smart and gone so far as to color code goals that are similar from student to student. And so that's one more thing that you might find really helpful. Now, before we look at the next steps in my 7-step process, I'm going to ask you to try and figure out the pattern. Here are a series of numbers that are organized in a very specific pattern. Pause the video now and see if you can figure out what the pattern is. I hope you haven't been too frustrated. Some of you may have figured it out, and maybe some of you have not. These numbers are arranged alphabetically. Now, I'm betting that most of you did it mathematically because that's the way we always do it. So of course, we think first to go mathematically. But remember that specially designed instruction means that we're adapting, we're changing, we're supposed to be doing something different. So these next 3 steps, 4, 5, and 6, is where that adaptation, that transformation, the design of the lesson happens. So the first 3 steps, information gathering, now we're moving into that process for making those adaptations. As you're watching this next video, I want you to be paying attention to how, as a special educator, I'm not trying to be the general ed content expert. Instead, I'm bringing in my own expertise. We have a general ed expert, which is great. And so what do I bring in that's different? And a lot of that has to do with those executive function or access skills that might be missing, especially when we have IEP goals related to that. This particular video clip part will last about 4 minutes in length. Here we go. I was thinking about this. I had taken a quick glance at this morning, and I was thinking about what I know about the memory research.
Sure.
And so I want to come at it first from that angle. Are you anticipating that you're going to lecture about each of the roles?
Yeah, so what I've done in the past is kind of a couple different parts. So I'd lecture for 3, 4, 5 minutes about one of the roles. Then there'd be a discussion question where the students would have a partner and they discuss a scenario related to the role, and then we do some large group conversation. Those small partner discussions honestly haven't gone so well in the past. And I just don't feel like students get a good grasp on the roles, then they're not able to have a good conversation about it. And so it kind of has fallen apart.
Right. So when you're lecturing, students are taking notes?
Yeah, so they have a note sheet, a guided note sheet in front of them where they're writing down the definitions. And then they're also recording some examples of the president performing that role.
So I know some of our kids, when they're struggling with note taking, part of the issue is they're trying to multitask, right? There's a lot of cognitive load there.
Yeah.
So you're lecturing and you're probably giving some extra really great information, not just the line that's on the slide, but they're so busy trying to write down that exact line that they're not really listening
Sure.
to you.
Sure.
And I hate that they're missing all of that.
Yeah,
So I've recently been doing a lot of reading around memory, and one of the things that the research says is this concept of retrieve taking instead of note taking.
sure.
So retrieve taking is you say to the students, I'm gonna tell you for 5 minutes, or I'm gonna lecture for a few minutes about this,
Yeah.
and you are not allowed to take notes. So
Okay.
pens down, and they just have to listen to
Sure.
you. And then when you're done, you say, now write down everything you can remember about what I just said.
Hmm.
So you forewarn them that that's what they're gonna do. So
Sure.
what they're doing there is they're retrieving the information that
Yep.
they've just heard. They're trying to retrieve that and write it down. And then you can have students compare
Right.
their notes to a peer's notes or to your
Sure.
lecture slide or something and see if they missed anything.
Great. And if they did miss something, can they add to their notes
Yes.
at that point then?
Yes, they add that in.
Sure.
So what the research shows is that that's actually more likely to consolidate the memory than if they're doing that heavy cognitive load and multitasking and
Right.
not paying attention.
Yeah, I really like that because I'm not concerned I'm not concerned that they can reiterate exactly, what I said, but have an
Mhm.
understanding in their own words. And I think this is really allowing them to
Right.
do that.
That also kind of takes care of any kids who have visual perception problems where, they're looking up at the board and far point copying is hard or, all of that, which just becomes difficult for them.
Sure.
The other thing is that there's a lot of memory research that says, as an example, that when you use a graphic organizer of some kind to gather your information rather than linear notes, that having information in locations on a page is easier to recall.
Oh,
So that's called
interesting.
episodic memory. So when you just have a long list of kind of linear sketch notes, much harder to close your eyes and picture where things were.
Yeah.
Whereas if instead you've got information in locations on a page, you can kind of close your eyes and think, okay, it was in that top right-hand corner and it's
Sure.
easier to remember.
Okay.
So given that I knew that this is where you're going, I was thinking about, there's a memory strategy. I forget what it's called. It's like the mansion memory trick or
Okay.
something. But the idea is that the memory champions, there's a memory championship, an international memory
Interesting.
championship. And what they do is they picture a house with lots of rooms, and then they put information in each room and they travel through the house,
Oh.
and then they can remember, okay, I turned right here and there was this, and and so it's
Interesting.
like this. So I was thinking if we could do a hybrid of that, what if we just had kids either draw or we could give them like a 2-story house
Okay.
with, 3 or 4 rooms on the bottom and a couple of rooms up top.
Sure.
And as they went through the 7 roles, they were actually kind of putting the roles in
In each of the rooms.
spaces. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't have some linear notes,
Right.
maybe, but maybe all of their notes could be in rooms
Yeah.
instead.
I love that. And because we're talking about the roles of the president, maybe we could even make it the White House
Oh,
as
that
as the
would be
house
great.
that was there. That might
That
kind
would
of
be
fun.
really great.
All right. Feel free now to pause and discuss or reflect on what you've seen. Now, just a note, if we were to just hand kids a graphic organizer, that would be an accommodation and it might be very helpful. But instead, we would be teaching students how to use this memory strategy to create a graphic organizer that's going to enhance their retention of that information. And then that becomes a generalizable skill that they can use in other situations. So that's the important part, is the instruction that goes along with that. Now, that step 6 is about making sure those executive function skills are addressed if necessary. So one of the tools that I've created is just a list down the left-hand column of the most common executive function categories or access skill categories. And then we can go through and decide whether it's required for the lesson, and do we have students that have deficits or IEP goals or accommodations, and where we're going to prioritize. Because sometimes we decide to do a mini lesson that addresses that particular executive function skill. Last but not least, we need to make sure we're building in methods that are going to boost student participation, because if they're not participating in the lesson, then, it's not a good use of time. And there's lots of ways to boost participation: movement, competition, student choice, topics of interest, all of those kinds of things. But the number one thing I try to think of first is making sure that we are taking advantage of doing small group instruction whenever possible. If you have two adults, it's much easier, but even as a single adult, a single teacher in a room, I can do small group instruction by having some kids perhaps work independently or with technology while I work with another group. But in a co-taught classroom, we aim for 65% of the week to be spent in small group instruction, anything other than whole group. So now let's just watch one last bit as Jeff and I talk about how to integrate small group instruction into this 2-day lesson.
7 roles.
Mhm.
Because we've got multiple roles, is there a way we could do it in multiple stations
Sure,
instead of whole group?
yeah, that might be more effective.
You know, you don't need to get them all done in one day, so we could do 3 one day, 4 the next.
I like that.
Now, if there's more than 2 and there's only 2 of us, that would mean we're gonna have at least one station that has to be independent.
Sure, yeah,
Do you think we could create a station that had some, I don't know, using technology? They
yeah.
were provided the information?
Sure, I think we could easily make a station just with some quick current event video clips of President Trump or another past president using or performing those roles, or you or I could make maybe make a really quick 5-minute video that summarizes the role with some examples. So I think we certainly can, maybe a QR code that the kids scan with their iPads when you get
Great.
there and watch that.
Great, so some kind of flipped instruction in
Yeah.
a sense, but right there in the
Mhm.
room. And then we could have you at one role and I could be at another role. Now, what do you think about, I'm thinking about the students with IEP goals and really wanting to really double down on that memory instruction. So while we could give all the students, like I could give an overview to all the kids about that mansion idea, we're gonna use the White House, we're gonna put these in there. But I'd love to be able to really hit that harder with students that need that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what if we did at least one leveled group?
Okay,
So if we have 3 groups, we could have one that was leveled with kids with memory IEP goals.
yep.
And I could actually move with that group
That's
rather than me staying put.
Sure,
So whatever, that would mean that you'd have to move too, right?
Yep.
So if you have
Yep.
one station, I have another station, we both need to be able to know how to teach at each station.
yeah, that's fine. That
But then
sounds
I
good.
could kind of double down on that.
I love it.
Okay, I like that better.
All right, there we go. So we've been through our 7 steps and kind of just, hopefully whetted your appetite for co-planning that looks like that. If you are someone that's in a role of leadership or coaching, I do want to suggest just a couple of questions that I think are really critical to be asking of our educators on an ongoing basis. And if you are a practitioner, a teacher yourself, then these are 2 questions that you can be asking yourself. They're ones that I've always asked myself, either before a lesson or after a lesson as well. So those 2 key questions are these. First, what IEP goal did you work on today? If you're doing a walkthrough in a classroom, what IEP goal are you working on in this lesson? These can be questions that are embedded into your formal evaluations as well. Definitely your informal evaluations or walkthroughs or observations would be great. And then secondly, what did you do that was special? Or when I'm asking myself, what did I do that was special in this lesson? Or what am I planning to do that's special in this lesson? I really believe that if these 2 questions become part of our ongoing dialogue over and over and over again, we're bringing these up and we're reflecting on them and talking about them, that specially designed instruction will become a really effective, ongoing component, really solid component of the programming for all of our students with disabilities with IEP goals. And that is their fundamental right under the law. So making sure that happens is going to bring about great progress for our students. Last but not least, I'm going to have you do a quick summary strategy. This is something that we do in classrooms as well. I call it the inverted pyramid. So on your paper or note somewhere, go ahead and draw an inverted pyramid, maybe about 3 inches wide across the top, and then draw 3 lines to divide it into 4 segments. Once you've got that, in that first segment, I want you to write down a 4-word phrase that captures something from your learning today, then a 3-word phrase, a 2-word phrase, and at the bottom, a single word. This is something that we do with students. It's very flexible. They can use whatever language they want. They can go in different orders. And of course, you could have 5 segments or just 2 or 3 segments, however you want to set it up. And then we have students do some quick sharing at the end. We might have them turn and share their entire pyramid with someone, or maybe we say something like, okay, everybody, let's just share out loud our 2-word summary. And we go around the room and share out that 2-word summary. My 2 words for you are thank you. Thank you for all that you do for students in your school, your classrooms, your districts, your regions, your states. And thank you for participating in this session on specially designed instruction. For more information, go to speciallydesignedinstruction.org, where you'll find case studies, video links, all kinds of things, all kinds of great resources. Or feel free to email me if you have questions, Anne@ideasforeducators.com.